Welcome to the Explainer. Whenever we see an animal just totally thriving in some unbelievably harsh environment, we would kind of tend to chalk it up to magic, right? Or just incredibly good luck. But the reality? The reality is actually far more fascinating. Survival is not a lottery. It is a calculated, precision-engineered biological strategy.
Okay, let's dive into this. Today we're conducting a structured biological audit. We're going to hit the architects of survival, finding your ecological address, choosing an ecological profession, hardware, software, and strategy, and finally, the blueprint of resilience.
So, consider this for a second. How exactly does a polar bear stay cozy on a landscape made of literal ice? Or think about a cactus. How does it thrive in a desert that hasn't seen a single drop of rain in months? As we go through this explainer, you're going to see that these absolutely aren't accidents. We are decoding the secret, calculated logic of nature here, and every single feature of life is a direct response to that logic.
Which brings us to part 1, the architects of survival, setting the board. Let's look at the physical constraints of the natural world. Now, when we talk about ecology, we're really not just doing a basic survey of geography. Ecology is the scientific study of the relational dynamics between living organisms and their physical environments. Basically, it's a highly strategic web of interactions. Life isn't just sitting there, it is simultaneously responding to and literally modifying its surroundings. And the boundaries of this strategic web? Well, they're drawn by 4 critical non-living architects: air, water, soil, and climate. These form the abiotic baseline. And I want to highlight something absolutely fascinating here. Soil composition and water availability essentially create what we call a metabolic ceiling. To put that in perspective, they put a hard, immovable limit on the types of vegetation that can even anchor at a site. And that directly dictates the energy availability for the entire food web. Basically, you just can't outgrow the ceiling your environment sets.
Moving right along to Section 2, finding your ecological address, aquatic versus terrestrial. This is where we look at the extreme pressures organisms face based on where they actually live. There's this super fascinating contrast between the 2 major systems on Earth. In aquatic systems, the main governing forces are dissolved oxygen and light penetration. Because light just plummets the deeper you go, these habitats function as highly stable, layered vertical neighborhoods. Organisms there basically float, swim, or anchor themselves to survive. But on the flip side, terrestrial systems are defined by wild temperature swings and a huge dependence on rainfall. Life on land is basically subject to constant atmospheric chaos. And right in the middle of that atmospheric chaos on land, there is one ultimate villain: the risk of desiccation. We're talking about the constant, literally life-threatening danger of drying out. It is the absolute primary selective pressure in terrestrial habitats. If an organism wants to even try to survive on land, it must evolve masterful water conservation tactics just to be a viable candidate for moving in. All right, Section 3, choosing an ecological profession, also known as the niche strategy. Let's look at what organisms actually do once they establish their physical location. So the crucial point is this most important dichotomy of our entire explainer: habitat versus niche. The habitat is the address. It's the physical location where the organism lives, where it finds food, water, and shelter. But the niche, that's the profession. It's the functional role the organism performs within that environment. Think of it this way. If the habitat is the forest, the niche is being the specific bird that eats a very specific type of insect at a very specific time of day. Now, you might be wondering, why is this distinction so vital? Well, it's all about resource conflict mitigation. This is essentially nature's brilliant peacekeeping strategy. See, by specializing in completely different professions, specifically how they acquire food, how they interact socially, and how they contribute to the environment, multiple species can actually share the exact same address without directly competing until they exhaust the resources. It entirely prevents a biological war of attrition. Moving into Section 4, hardware, software, and strategy, the biological toolkit. Here we'll look at the precision-engineered biological tools required to actually execute these professions. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. Look at these specific examples of the toolkit in action. We see structural traits like the super thick fur on polar animals, behavioral traits like the complex migration patterns of birds, and physiological traits like venom production in snakes. Every single one of these is a meticulously calculated response to their specific environment. We call this whole setup the adaptation matrix, and it serves as our hard evidence for niche occupancy.
It's broken down into three main pillars. First, structural adaptations. Those are the physical features of the body. Second, behavioral adaptations, the action patterns or survival instincts. And third, physiological adaptations, the internal chemical or biological processes that just keep the organism functioning day to day. To really, truly grasp this, we have to lean into a specific metaphor here: hardware versus software. Structural adaptations are the hardware. They are the physical tools. Think of a fish's beautifully streamlined body. It is just an incredible piece of hydrodynamic hardware. Behavioral adaptations, on the other hand, are the software, the programming. It's the instinctual drive of that fish to actually swim after its prey.
Which leads us to a pretty provocative question. What good is structural hardware without behavioral software? Seriously, think about it. If a desert animal has the physical capability, the hardware, to hide in the shade, but completely lacks the behavioral instinct, the software, to be nocturnal and actually avoid the intense daytime heat, what happens?
The answer is pretty dramatic. It becomes an evolutionary sunk cost. A physical tool is completely, totally useless. In ecological terms, an assessment is actually professionally negligent if it just documents the physical hardware. We have to verify the behavioral software to prove the organism can actually operate the hardware and function in the ecosystem. And hey, let's not forget the final pillar here: physiological adaptations, or the internal strategy. This is how an organism survives when the external environment is just relentlessly hostile. The absolute gold standard for this? The camel. Through sheer metabolic efficiency, a camel conserves water internally, maintaining homeostasis for crazy long periods without an external water source. It's basically a walking internal fortress against the risk of desiccation. Bringing us to our final section, Section 5, the blueprint of resilience, the final audit. Let's pull all these strategic elements together.
When ecologists go out to measure the actual resilience of a site, they use an assessor's checklist just like this one. First, they audit the abiotic profile to find that metabolic ceiling we talked about earlier. Then they identify the medium. Is it an aquatic vertical neighborhood or terrestrial atmospheric chaos? Next, they distinctly separate the organism's profession from its address. Then, they dual verify both the hardware and the software. And finally, they check if this specialization successfully manages resources to keep the peace. This kind of high-quality reporting is absolutely crucial for measuring site resilience.
Which leaves us with this crucial, provocative final thought to reflect on today. As environments inevitably shift, the absolute greatest strategic failure in ecological management is this: are we protecting the address but completely destroying the profession? Because, if we preserve the habitat but accidentally compromise the niche, the species will fail anyway. Survival is an interconnected, precision-engineered blueprint. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep looking at the world through this strategic lens, and I will see you next time.